It's such a pleasure to introduce Arthur Golden that you can hardly call it work. I mean, imagine that you are invited to read a novel like this and forget that what you do it for, because it's a very absorbing novel, and then being allowed to introduce a writer like that to an audience. The book is called Memoirs of a Geisha. It is in Dutch called Dagboek van een Geisha, uitgegeven bij Antos. And Arthur Golden, I'm sure he will introduce himself. I mean, he will introduce himself much more by talking to you. But he studied Japanese art and history in Harvard and Columbia. And I think he will tell us ourselves he worked a very long time on this book. Probably many of you already have read this book, and this is why you are here, but in case you haven't, it's a wonderful story about a woman called Sayuri, born in between the two world wars. I always want to say our last war, but unfortunately it isn't. In a poor fisherman's family, she is sold in 1929 to a geisha house, and we follow her story. Her innocence, that she doesn't know what is happening to her. Step by step we see how she gets educated into becoming a geisha. It takes a very long time, you can see it coming in this book, that she will find out that her virginity is worth a lot of money, and it is sold to the highest bidder when she is 15. And all this time she hopes for the attention of one special man that made an impression for her, and dear reader, she gets him in the end. So it is a very satisfying book. On different levels, very satisfying. It is satisfying because it's not a fashionable thin book as we publish them in Europe. It is a real story that we can follow on every page. Reminding us of the wonderful novels of a century before, like for instance Jane Austen, but also, and I hope Arthur is not offended, because I'm a great fan of soap, it is this following the story from page to page that is really wonderful. It's also very satisfying because, of course, it is it satisfies our curiosity about another culture, about another people, and especially trying to understand what this symbol of Japaneseness, the geisha, is really like. And for me, I don't know anything about Japan, but it is very convincing in that it shows something, what it's like to be in a different culture. It is written in the first person, which is another thing that I will ask Arthur about later. How did he dare to do this? To get inside a person that's very different from him. And it has a lot of, I would call, sensuous detail about kimonos, about... It's almost a book that you can smell and feel, with all the details about food and drink and dress and everyday surroundings. Years ago, I remember a lot of discussion about literature and women's literature. They seem to be two different things. You had literature and then you had women's literature, which was usually called women's books, since people weren't sure that this was literature. And I was thinking about a little test, and I never did it, but it would be exciting to do it now, maybe, now that this whole discussion about this has slowed down. Because there was a discussion, is there a difference between the way men write and the way women write? And I said, let's do a test. Let's take a lot of books and tear off the cover so you can't see who's written them, and ask people to read them and let them guess, is this a book written by a woman or a book by a man? And I think in most cases people would be right about guessing. I never did it because it is a cruel thing to tear covers of books. I also work for a publisher, and it's painful to even think of doing it. But I think you would have two heaps of books and some mistakes in between where people think this book is written by a man and it isn't, or think it's written by a woman and it isn't. And I think if I would have done this test with this book and wouldn't have known, I probably would have put it on the heap of the women's books. And I mean this as a compliment, because this story is about a woman. And this discussion, of course, took place because for a very long time, when there were books about, also books about men or women writing about women's lives, especially when they were written about men, sometimes these women in these books were not real. Well, this woman in this book is not real, but usually it was, you read about fantasy creatures that seem to be projected out of a mixture of lust and fear. And this could have very well be the case with especially this subject, a geisha. Everybody says, well, this is the most exotic symbol of another exotic world. But in this time, in this book, it is very convincing. We see the world through the eyes of a woman, and you can really live with her and see the world the way she sees it. For instance, another writer would have taken this subject on a geisha and had written a completely different book. You could have made it into sort of soft pornography very easily. It's not become that. For instance, we look through the eyes of this geisha at her clients, at the men she has to amuse and flatter, and it is not always a very flattering portrait of the man she meets. And this is also something that I think is very special about this book, that on the one hand it takes away this image of geishas are just prostitutes. On the other hand, it isn't making it into something just elegant, because we see a lot of very bored, drunk and bad-mannered men, and we can also see how hard work it is to keep these men amused and feel good. The interesting thing about this is, and we're going, probably Arthur will talk about this to us ourselves, and if not, I will ask this question afterwards. Actually, as a writer, he is writing in the first person, but he is 3 times removed from the actual person in the book. First, because he is a Westerner writing about Japanese culture, which is a big distance. The second is that he is writing about, as a man, about a woman, which is another difference in culture. And there is the difference in time, because he is writing about the time that obviously he has not lived in himself. So my question is to him, my first question will be, and maybe he will answer it, how dare he? Maybe Arthur will tell us ourselves how he did it.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here in Amsterdam, and I have to begin by telling you 2 things I'm enormously grateful for. One is Anna Wertheim's help. She invited me over here, and in fact invited me for 3 days, and I said, great, I'll stay 9. And you know that old saying about guests and fish starting to smell bad after 3 days. And yet, despite all that, she has been enormously generous and helpful to me the entire time I've been here. I leave tomorrow morning. She finally gets rid of me, but I'm very grateful for that. The second thing I'm enormously grateful for is that I do not have to give this talk in Dutch. I have taken 2 Dutch lessons, and the only thing I know how to say is, mijn naam is Hanny Pieters and ik woon in Utrecht. And it isn't until a later lesson, that you get to, mijn naam is Arthur Golden and ik woon in Boston, so I don't know how to say that. So I will proceed in English, as I say, with gratitude to all of you for understanding me. This novel of mine, let me begin by telling you that I've read some very interesting things about myself in the paper over the course of the last year and a half, such as, for example, that I'm a professor at Harvard, or that I'm a professor at various universities. And in fact, journalists who call me up for interviews often start off by calling me Professor Golden, and I have to finally tell them, I'm not a professor. I don't teach anywhere, actually. And it's been very interesting because the assumption, as I've come to understand it, actually another thing I've been fascinated to read is, isn't it amazing that a man wrote this book from the point of view of a woman, and it seems believably like a woman. It took me about 6 months to figure out that the message underneath that was, men are such lunks that it's impossible to imagine a man, which may actually, the fact that it took me 6 months to figure it out may indeed be evidence that it's true. I'll leave that one for you to decide. But the other thing about being a professor was that it took me some time to understand that I had worked very hard to create a sense of easy familiarity with Japanese culture, that I know all these things because, of course, it's not me, it's the geisha. I had to make the geisha look like a geisha, and geisha know these things. So I had to take my reference books off the shelf, absolutely every sentence I wrote, to make sure that it all seemed believable. And yet, I keep hearing about myself as a professor. I have to tell you, nothing could be further from the truth. Let me tell you how I came to write this novel. It isn't, as I've found so many people imagine, because I knew so much about geisha that I decided one day to sit down and write about it. In fact, what happened is this. I was studying Japan in college, and I went to graduate school thinking indeed that perhaps I would become a professor in Japanese history, but after about a year and a half, I decided that I did not want to live my life in academics. I do not mean to... I have the greatest respect for academicians, particularly if there are any in the audience. But I didn't want to live in a university in my life, even though I love them. And I decided to cut it short and go off and live and work in Japan, where I was eager to sort of spend time speaking the language, which was something I'd invested a lot of energy in. And while I was there, I met a young man whose mother was a geisha and whose father was an internationally famous businessman. I had occasion to meet the father in the presence of this young man a couple of times, and I was struck by the formality of this relationship. I mean, formality may not even be the right word for it. There was another guy I knew who had grown up with this young man and told me a story one time of picking up the father at the airport in the father's Rolls Royce. And this guy who was telling the story said that when they got everybody in the car and shut the door, this guy's hair got caught in the door. And he didn't want to disrupt things. So he rode the whole way from Narita Airport, which is about 90 minutes outside Tokyo, into Tokyo with his hair slammed in the door. This was how comfortable this old man made people feel. And I was struck by that. It was something that fascinated me, that this young man could have grown up with a father who had such tremendous presence in the world that he would have been even larger than a larger-than-life figure in the eyes of this child, who would have had no relationship of familial warmth with him at all. That, I thought, was material for a novel. Well, I got back to the States, and I decided to write that novel, and I began work on it. The trouble was I didn't have any idea what I was doing. I, never written a novel before, and even though I think people who've never tried to write novels imagine that people who do it just sit down and it comes out, at least in my case it didn't. I sat down and I wanted to write a novel focusing on something like 35 years in the life of this young man. And I got to about page 75, and I was absolutely horrified to discover that I was still on day 2. It wasn't moving right along. And the trouble was I hadn't yet learned this wonderful thing about writing fiction, which is that you can leave things out. You don't have to put everything in the book. I began by waking him up in the morning, and I had him drink some tea, and then I had him go off and talk to somebody and drink some more tea, and I'd go off to talk to somebody else and drink some more tea, and then I'd suddenly say, oh my God, this guy, he hasn't even gone to the bathroom yet, you know. So I'd rush him urgently off to the bathroom, you know, and try to make a meaningful scene out of it. And anyway, let's just say that it didn't go too well. And it was about 1987 when I decided that the time had come for me to learn a little something about geisha, because after all, there was a mother in this novel who I hadn't really paid much attention to, who was a geisha. And I began to read about the subject. And what I discovered was that I was absolutely fascinated. It was the kind of material that I love to read novels about. I mean, I wanted to write the novel that I wanted to read, and I love those books like I, Claudius, that give you a glimpse of a world that you just can't experience otherwise, and give you a sense, the illusion of actually having lived there, lived that world. I mean, you know, I've heard it said that people read novels because they want to live other lives. And, you know, I find the novels most satisfying that do that. Well, here was material. Here was a really other life, a life that was hard even to imagine. And I decided that I would write about that. I didn't think it was going to be that big a deal, because I knew Japan, you know, and I spoke the language reasonably. And, well, you know, I could do research about the rest of the part. How strange could the world of geisha possibly be? So I found every book I could on the subject, and I read. Didn't tell me a lot, but I thought, well, you know, things like makeup, you put on makeup. I mean, that's not so complicated. So it's all variations on that, and I sat down and I wrote a novel. And it was about 750 pages. It took me 3 years, and it focused on 5 years in the life of an adult geisha shortly after World War II, and I wrote it in third person. Now, the reason I wrote it in third person, it speaks to all those questions that Anya was posing. You know, I don't think I have to persuade you that I'm not a geisha. Although, the American cover, which many of you in the audience don't know, can I borrow your book? This isn't going to do any good because you need binoculars, but this is the American cover. It shows a beautiful image of a geisha from 1904, and they've done this wonderful thing. They've split her so she's kind of on the spine, stares out at you from the bookcase to remind you, don't forget to read me, by the way. And it's a cover I'm very happy with, quite different from the absolutely beautiful, also beautiful Dutch cover with the the lips. And in any case, a woman in Denver raised her hand and said, excuse me, is that you on the cover? And I mean, you know, I didn't know whether to say, you know, that it was me on a good day or me on a bad day. I promised to give this back. But I knew this was not what I saw in the mirror back in 1987, and that was why I decided to write the novel in third person. And it wasn't just that I wrote it in third person. I had made the conscious decision that I would keep my sensibility and her sensibility in completely separate boxes. I didn't want to try too hard to imagine what life as she experienced it was like, because it was going to be so different. Well, I got the novel finished, and I began to revise it, and just then I got a phone call from a friend in Japan. I found you a geisha, Arthur, to interview in Kyoto. Well, I talked to a Tokyo geisha, briefly, one who lived in New York City, as it happens. And what I discovered in the course of that interview was that Tokyo geisha and Kyoto geisha sneer at one another like you would not believe. And I wasn't going to get any information out of her that was going to be useful unless I was willing to move the novel to Tokyo, and I decided in the end I wasn't willing to do that. But I found through this friend, this geisha, I didn't find, she found for me this geisha in Kyoto, and who had retired some years earlier in order to marry, but was still quite young. I mean, 42, in fact, unbelievably young. I say that because I'm 42. And she had retired some years earlier in order to marry, and had a very difficult life. She'd been sold by her parents when she was 7 years old, back in 1956, the very year, in fact, when I was born. And she had 2 children now that she was married, and one of whom had died. I mean, things had just not gone well for her. But I discovered when I got there that she was very willing to talk to me about the life of a geisha. I think in part, perhaps, well, large part, because she was doing a favor for the person who introduced us. It really is as simple as that, I believe. But also, she knew that I wasn't a journalist. I wasn't asking for information about any of her clients or even stories about her life. I never asked her about her life. I didn't want to know that. What I wanted to know was, how do geisha live? How do they put on their makeup? What are the circumstances? And she was fascinating. She took my understanding of the world of geisha and turned it absolutely upside down. To give you a trivial example, I'd written a scene in my novel the first time around in which my geisha put on her makeup. And as I mentioned, I thought, well, how big a deal could it possibly be putting on makeup? And so I decided I would jazz it up a little bit, and I had her take some black powder and paint a streak like this down her cheeks, and then paint over it with that white powder that geisha wear. And the idea was that if a man should do something during the course of the evening to make her cry, the tears would wash away the white powder and leave a streak of black that would poetically accentuate her emotions in a way I regarded at the time as very geisha-like. Well, when I began to talk to Minako, one of the first things I discovered was that geisha are entertainers. You know, they're entertainers, and crying in front of a man is not high on the list of things that you might be asked to do during the course of the evening. But the other problem was that Minako took me around on a tour of the Gion district. She took me to see an apprentice geisha being dressed, and she took me to a wig maker, and she took me up to the little school where the geisha are trained, and she took me to a cosmetics shop. And it looked like any cosmetics shop anywhere, with Maybelline over there. I don't know how to say that in Dutch. And, Estee Lauder over here. But I know you know what I'm talking about, that kind of stuff. And, there in one corner, just one little corner, was all this wacky stuff that geisha used. And I was delighted to see it all. And I bought one of everything, and I took it back with me and suggested to her that I ought to put it on because I wanted to know what it felt like. And she gave me this sort of look, and I decided that for some reason or other that was a bad idea, so I didn't push it. But when I got back to Boston and it came time to write this scene, I went and locked the bathroom door really well, And then I started with a bar of wax, as Minako had told me she did, and I kneaded it in my fingertips until it was soft. Then I rubbed it into, I wasn't going to make myself up. I just wanted to have a tactile experience of the makeup. So I rubbed the wax into my face. I made a paste of white powder. I painted it on. And let me just say that you would have to cry really hard. I mean, you would have to cry. You could pretty much stand in front of a fire hose, and this stuff would not come off. So on this fairly trivial score, I had gotten a basic scene, a really basic factual scene in the book, completely wrong. And it turned out, the more I talked to Minako, the more I discovered it was true of every scene. I hadn't understood, for example, the fundamental economics of that world, that a young geisha making her debut at the age of 14, let's say, is going to be wearing the most elaborate kimono she'll ever wear, because the younger you are, the more exuberantly you dress. A 14-year-old really puts on the dog. Very expensive robes, a beautiful long obi. We're talking maybe $40,000 worth of kimono for one night, and you've got to wear a different one every night. And there's seasons there, too, so you change your kimono according to the seasons, and the result is that you have a collection of kimono that is almost invaluable. They have to be worn by a 14-year-old who is at the point in her life when she has the lowest earning power she'll ever have. It's a kind of formula for indentured servitude, and that's exactly how the geisha districts worked back in that time. They really were slaves for this reason, because in large part of the kimono, it was something I hadn't understood. I also hadn't understood the astonishing price that a mizuage could fetch. Mizuage is the ritual deflowering of a geisha, and although it's true in a sense that geisha are not prostitutes, it's also true that there is one moment in their lives when they undeniably are, and that is when their virginity is auctioned off to the highest bidder. Minako and her husband both were very proud that her virginity had set a record in the Gion district, selling for, this is much too large a group to do this sort of thing, but in a radio interview or that sort of thing, I love saying, guess how much? And the answers are things like $20,000, which is a lot of money, of course, but Minako's virginity had sold for 100 million yen, which in today's U.S. dollars would be about $750,000. That's a sum, and I was telling this one time in a gathering like this one, and a young woman in the back piped up and said, "Well, I gave mine away and he was such a jerk," which I thought was great. And I have to tell you, too, that whenever I tell that, the women always laugh much louder than the men do. But anyway, I got back to the States and quickly reached the conclusion that I could do nothing but throw out my entire first draft and start all over again from scratch. And I did that. I started again, and I wrote the novel again the second time, the same way I'd written it the first time, except that this time all the historical details were more or less accurate. It was, again, about an adult geisha, about 5 years in her life, shortly after the war, and again, of course, as I may have already just said, in third person. I got it finished, I began to revise it, pass it around to some friends and so on who knew something or other about publishing, and word began to trickle back to me that the book was dry. Well, I'd been attracted to this material because I found it fascinating. I couldn't resist it, and here I'd woven it into a book that people were finding dry. I didn't consider that a good sign. And I think the first person who said it to me, I must have thought, I've always thought this guy was probably a jerk underneath it all. But after I began to hear it from a number of people, I came to the conclusion that there must be some truth to it, and I formulated a kind of plan of attack. I'm a very analytical person by nature. In fact, about 2 months ago, I was signing a book for someone, and just as I finished my signature, she said, "I'm a handwriting analyst." And I thought, oh, great, I thought I was signing a book and I'm bearing my soul, and so I handed her the book, and I was just making conversation. I didn't expect her to reply at all. I sort of said, "Well, I wonder what you would make of that." And as she took it from me, she said, very analytical about your creativity." Well, that really was like a magic trick, because it's absolutely true. I don't know how she did it. I have much more respect for handwriting analysts now than I did before that. But it's true that I am very analytical, and so I formulated an analytically reasoned plan of attack. Step one was to go up to was actually to have a week-long anxiety attack bordering on panic, and that went off without a hitch. And then step two was to go up to my study and start scratching my head and trying to figure out what I had done wrong. I came to the conclusion that there were two things principally. The first was that I had chosen to write about an adult rather than a child. Now, the trouble was that the novel was about many things in my mind, but one of the things it was about, aside from my interest in the character and in the story, was the world itself. And that's what had attracted me in the first place. But an adult turns out to be a very poor guide to that world, because the first time an adult puts on her makeup, nothing new for her. She's put it on 5,000 times before, so if you want to tell the reader about it, you have to grind the narrative to a halt and deliver a lecture. And it's that way with every aspect of the world of geisha. A child, on the other hand, is an excellent guide, because the first time she puts on her makeup, she feels about it the same way the reader does. It's a rite of passage you couldn't even leave out of the narrative. It's not simply a dull lecture. And beyond that, it seemed to me, as I thought about it, that all the drama was in her childhood. The second problem was that I had chosen to write in third person. It wasn't really the use of third person that troubled me. It was the decision to keep my sensibility and hers in separate boxes. As I thought about it, it seemed to me, I really can't escape having to make that imaginative leap across these chasms, these divides, these cultural divides, the most frightening one of which was male to female, more than American to Japanese. I mean, you can research the differences between American and Japanese culture. You can learn what Japanese do. You can learn about the past. You can even learn about geisha. But what do you do to do research about how women think, about how women feel? You can't really do anything about that. And that scared me, I have to confess, and that's why I had stuck safely in third person. But it seemed to me now I couldn't really get out of making that leap. So I started the book over again, this time in first person, and spent maybe 6 or 8 weeks trying to find a voice that I felt would be believable. And when I found one, I got to about page 75 and discovered that I'd written myself into a terrible conundrum. Because when I'd used a third person narrator, the narrator could do me this enormous service of stepping away from the narrative whenever I needed him to, him-ish, it, whatever, the voice to, and explaining things for us. I mean, somebody's got to do it. This is a very foreign world. We don't know what's going on. Somebody's got to help us out. But if the geisha herself is telling her own story, and she's lived in Kyoto all her life, the trouble is that she can't even know what we don't know. She won't be able to tell the story in a way we understand it. So I decided that the trick was, I had to get around it like this. She had to, first of all, end up in the United States and spend 40 years there at the end of her life. That way, she would develop her own Western sensibility. And then she had to tell the story looking back from through the filter of that Western experience, so that she could see her earlier life in a Western way, and she had to tell the story to a Westerner, not a Japanese. The more I thought about it, because if she told it to a Japanese, she wouldn't bother, you know. The more I thought about it, the more I liked the idea of a receiving consciousness, someone in the book who was listening to the story, because after all, geisha are storytellers, and I decided at that point to begin the novel with her in the room talking and saying, suppose that you and I were sitting. The reader very clearly to imagine a Westerner listening to the story. So I invented this translator, and as it happens, I made him Dutch. I did that for a couple of reasons. One was, there's a long history of relations between the Dutch and the Japanese. You know, it goes back quite a bit earlier than most Western contacts do. That was something I'd always known about. In fact, the Japanese called Western learning dangaku, Dutch learning. And there's a famous story of a Japanese educator who's considered the founder of the modern educational system in Japan, who spent his life learning Dutch so that he could speak to the foreigners. And then he got there and he met them, and they didn't understand a word of it because they were all speaking English. It was a horrifying moment for him. It was in the 1860s, maybe the 1850s. And in any case, that's the main reason I made him Dutch. But the other reason was I was attracted to the name. I gave him the name Jacob Haarhuis. And I gave him that name because it sounds, well, it was very important to me that anybody who get to the end of my novel come to understand that geisha are not merely prostitutes. It's much more complicated than that. On the other hand, Haarhuis sounds an awful lot like whorehouse. And I couldn't resist the inside joke, which I knew that nobody would really ever get. But I put it in there. I have a friend named Arnie Rusoff. And Arnie said to me one day in jest, so Arthur, where are you going to put me in the novel? And of course, there are no Westerners by name in the novel, so I made old Jakob, the Arnold Rusoff Professor of Japanese History at New York University. And I gather that they have actually gotten phone calls looking for Jacob Haarhuis, you know, and say, well, you know, he's the Arnold Rusoff Professor of Japanese History, for God's sakes. Huh? Much more fun for me than those phone calls I have not been there to hear are letters and phone calls I myself have received, saying things like, well, now, I know that the translator talked to the geisha, but who did you talk to? And, you know, I'm delighted by that. I really am, because I worked very hard to make it look as if this woman really existed. I mean, she didn't. I made her up, of course, but I wanted the reader to forget about me and to think that I didn't have anything to do with this book, and I'm thrilled when people don't know what role I played in it. But anyway, in fact, I mean, I'm sure you'll agree that having this attitude, it was a foolish choice to put my own face on the cover, but you know, my name, of course, appears here at the bottom. And this is true in the English and the Dutch editions as well, I believe, that after that, I am gone from the book. When you open most novels up, you get a dedication, acknowledgments, and then the text begins. In this book, there's no dedication. There's no acknowledgments. You start right away with a translator's note, and has somebody else's name on it besides me, and I'm gone. I mean, there's very few people who have any consciousness of my existence after that page, and that's just the way I want it. In fact, there are also no running heads. It doesn't say Memoirs of a Geisha by Arthur Golden at the top, for this very reason. Only at the end of the book do I step out from behind this beautiful curtain that the designer of the book put there. It's this sort of thing. There comes the dedication, and after that, the acknowledgments, simply because, well, I've already explained why. Sometimes in foreign translations, the acknowledgments get moved up front, along with the dedication and so on. I'm always sort of disappointed, but the Estonian edition actually left out the translator's preface. They figured, well, that guy translated into English. We don't need the translators. We're translating it into Estonian. And I think that's a shame, because all 30 people who read the book are going to miss that little nugget, you know. Let me speak briefly to something that Anya raised, and that is story. That, you know, story is such a dirty word, isn't it? I mean, especially here in Europe, where the tradition of storytelling in fiction has come to seem very old, you know, 19th century-ish kind of thing. Grown-ups concern themselves with more sophisticated things than that. But I have to plead the other side of the argument, because I don't believe that a story is in any way anti-intellectual or antithetical to the intellect, except in one sense. And let me explain what I mean by that. Imagine yourself at a dinner party, and you're a man, and the host of the dinner party is sitting nearby, and you look up and you realize that he's looking at you. And he doesn't look away for just a moment, and then he looks away. Big deal. Doesn't matter, it's meaningless. You don't put it in a novel, it doesn't belong there, it doesn't have any meaning behind it. But if you put a story behind this event, suppose that you're having an affair with his wife. Now when this guy looks at you a moment longer than he does and doesn't break eye contact, this is a bone-chilling event. I mean, the next thing that's going to happen is the phone call. I think he knows. This is a very, very big deal. That's what story, that's the simplest illustration I can give of what story provides that you simply cannot achieve otherwise. Story gives, in my view, momentum and meaning to events. If you put events in isolation, they're isolated and they don't have anything to do with anything. Context is everything. And what's more, you can go one step further. Now you have to ask yourself, well, if you're going to tell that, what's your chronology? Do you begin with the moment at the dinner party, and then you stop the forward movement of the narrative, go back in time, and tell the story of the affair? Or do you start with the story of the affair and work your way up to the event at the dinner party? Most people, including writers, will say it doesn't make any difference. It doesn't make any difference at all. I disagree very strongly. I think it makes an enormous difference. They're two completely different things, because if you start at the beginning and you tell the story of the affair, when you get to the dinner party, the reader will experience the event the same way the guy at the dinner party does. It's an emotional event. When you, on the other hand, begin with the event at the dinner party, it plants a question in the reader's mind. Now, when you go back and you tell the story of the affair, you're answering the question. It's an intellectual event. In my mind, this is the only sense in which story and non-story, story and intellect are antithetical, because when you break the forward movement of chronology, it usually does have something to do with filling in knowledge and information. I think only if you argue that feelings are childish can you argue that story is a waste of a writer's time. So I make that plea, not as an apology, but as an explanation for why I decided to begin at the beginning and go forward until I got to the end, in that very old-fashioned way that so many 19th century writers do. This is not a novel about an intellectual. This woman is a simple woman. She's somebody who has only this one perspective on the world, and it's her perspective on her life. She hasn't lived many lives. She doesn't have deep thoughts about the things that have happened to her, but she has deep feelings about them. And it seemed to me to do it any other way would have been a kind of bastardization of form. I think I'm nearing the end of my allotted time, but let me conclude, I think I have a couple more minutes, with just telling you about a couple of the wacky little things that have happened in my life in the last year since this book came out. I've got to tell you that all those years while I was up there writing it, my feeling was, God, I hope this thing gets published. That was really the overwhelming emotion I had. And I hoped not only would it get published, I hoped, God, I hope there's somebody out there who will actually read it. And I could hardly have been more astonished when the book hit the bestseller list in the US. I thought that was the most astonishing thing that had ever happened to me. Although, I quickly discovered that there's a corollary to that saying of Groucho Marx's, I wouldn't want to belong to a club that would have me as a member. And the corollary is, if it happened to me, it must not be a very big deal, or it wouldn't have happened to me, right? It would have happened to somebody else. And so, very quickly I came to feel that way about it. But there were a couple of things that happened that I still haven't quite been able to integrate. One of them is Madonna. Now, you think I'm kidding, but I'm not kidding. I couldn't make this up. Madonna, you may have seen her new look. Well, she read my book, and she was really taken with it, and she actually now has her friends call her Hatsu Momo. That worries me a little, but... and she changed her look. She's now a geisha. She's got short black hair, and, she's her version of a geisha anyway, for a couple of weeks. I don't know how long it's going to last. But that is something I really was not expecting. And I don't get me wrong. I do not mean to laugh at Madonna. I could hardly be more thrilled, and I mean that in every sense of the word. I take it as a compliment. And I'm also thrilled with the number of people who've become aware of the existence of my book because of her. I mean, she was on Larry King, you know, saying I read this wonderful book by Arthur Golden. You know, called Memoirs of a Geisha, and Larry King said, well, now, this thing about Geisha, she said it's pronounced Geisha. And anyway, the other thing, though, that was has been even more astonishing to me has to do with Hollywood. And that is, I didn't expect that this novel would appeal to Hollywood in any way because it's a very exotic subject. And, you know, they like to play it safe. I mean, independent filmmakers, that may be another story. But Hollywood, well, you know, we all know Hollywood. And I was astonished when my agent gave me a call in November, a month after the book had come out, and said, I've got some great news. Tomorrow morning, Columbia Pictures is going to make an offer on the book. Well, I was astonished, and I just bought a cell phone, you know, a mobile phone, and I took it with me down to the Miami Book Fair. I'd never had one before, and I got off the plane, and I checked my messages on my cell phone, and there was a message from my agent. Wonderful news, Columbia Pictures and all this great stuff, and I was thrilled, of course. So I called my editor, but she was out. I left her message, and I was just signing in at the hotel when my cell phone rang. And I took it out of my pocket, you know, and answered it. And I told her, and she said, God, Arthur, where are you, by the way? And I said, well, actually, I'm just walking across the lobby of the hotel in Miami. She said, oh, well, congratulations, you've turned into an asshole. And I said, well, what did I do? She said, well, you're walking across the lobby of the hotel talking on your cell phone about your movie deal. I had to kind of hand it to her, all right, okay. But I really did believe that that was my Hollywood moment. I mean, it happened in Miami, but that was my Hollywood moment. Because I did not think it likely that Hollywood would go any further with this. And so I was, you know, puzzled and a little curious when I got a call in January from the producer saying, Arthur, we want to get you out here for lunch. Now, the thing is, I live in Boston. And I'd been invited as far west as Wellesley, which is a good 15 minutes for lunch, but I had never been invited all the way to L.A. for lunch. So they sent me this wonderful first-class ticket. You know, you push a button and the footrest comes up. I love my publisher. I really do love my publisher, but they do not fly me around first class. I mean, I think they would pretty much tuck me up into the wheel wells if they could. But it's already overstuffed with other writers, of course. So, but I went out to L.A. and we had lunch. I didn't know what I was doing. It was nice lunch, you know. It was in the Rita Hayworth dining room at Columbia Pictures, and there were all these little guys in white coats sort of standing behind us, and we talked. We didn't talk that much about my book. I don't have any idea. I still to this day couldn't tell you what it was all about. It was fun, though. It was interesting, and I figured, okay, now. And that night, I went over to the producer's house for dinner, and there were about 7 or 8 people, and one of them was Mike Nichols. And I thought, all right, okay, this is my Hollywood moment. This definitely the coolest thing that's ever happened. This is definitely my Hollywood moment. Forget Miami. And then in April, I got a call from the producers saying, guess who's going to direct your movie? So I kind of went, you know, because I thought Mike Nichols, he was wooing him, and that was. But it turned out the answer was Steven Spielberg. Now, I have to tell you, my jaw hit the floor so fast. That's what this little dent right here is all about. And it turned out not to be an April Fool's joke. It's actually true. He's starting filming in about a year, and he's hired a wonderful costume designer named James Atchison, who did The Last Emperor and Dangerous Liaisons and so on. He's a very smart, very interesting, and very sweet guy who went off to Japan and came back with a fascinating discovery. He said, kimono design is mostly below the waist, but the shots in the movie are mostly above the waist. So what do you do about that one? You know, and I had to say, well, any idea what you do? But he had a very good idea, which was, he said what he was going to do was start collecting kimono whose design came above the waist and use them to sort of break the mold and create kimono for the film that had design above the waist where you would see it, but in a way that was typical of kimono design when it did that, which I think is an excellent solution to the problem. The set designer has also done a lot of work and built my novel begins with her reflecting on her tipsy house where she grew up, and there I went and saw the model of the tipsy house. I mean, you know, I made the thing up, and I would have made it a little tipsier, but it's nice. And Also, a lot of the casting has been done. The role of Sayuri will be played by Whoopi Goldberg, and the... No, I'm just kidding, I'm just kidding. But there was that moment there where you were picturing her in the white makeup and the hair ornaments. The role of Sayuri will be played... I was actually concerned about this whole question of casting, whether they would cast Westerners in the film. And after about a week after that phone call about Spielberg, I got a call from Spielberg. I was in my kitchen and he was in his jet. It's true, I'm not kidding. And we had this wonderful conversation for about an hour, and during it I read him a passage from a magazine article suggesting who might be cast in certain roles, and they were all Western, and happily he laughed at this, which is not to say I didn't trust his sensibility, but you can't always be sure, and in fact he's cast all Japanese. The role of Sayuri will be played by a young Japanese woman who has lived for 9 years in the US and is a dancer and has never been in a movie before. Though I've seen her screen test and met her, and I think she's fabulous, and I'm very excited about seeing the thing on the silver screen. I'm confident of one thing: it will be a visually splendid movie, because it is a visually splendid world, which I did my best to capture in this book, but which has a reality that already exists and is difficult not to appreciate. Well, I'll stop there, and we can all listen to the shamisen. It turns out, this the shamisen is a kind of, it's hard not to characterize it as a Japanese banjo. It's really what it is. It's a folk instrument, and when you pull out a shamisen and sing it, it sounds very exotic and classical, but the thing to remember, in a way, is that in the 19th and 18th centuries, this would have really been just like pulling out a guitar and singing a folk song. I mean, they're entertainers, Geisha are. This is a much more elegant instrument, the koto, in the sense that it's more revered. The shamisen is sort of like a guitar. It gets no respect in a way, although it does in Japan. The guitar doesn't much. But that's a kind of instrument of the classical court. Anyway, this was very beautiful. I look forward to the other part. So, thank you very much.
Can I have your attention, please? Just a few words. First of all, we'd like to apologize for the little problem that we had. Those instruments are difficult to tune. I wasn't tuned before we started. Just a few words about the song. The song is called Kurokami. It's a story of a geisha. And the song is talking about her feelings when she's alone and waiting for her man that is not arriving. And they have all kinds of feelings, sad stories and sad feelings. Enjoy. Thank you very much.
し懐かしやるせなや積もるとしら積もるしらゆき
Thanks, by the way, for that music. That was beautiful.
Okay. Again, I will first ask some questions and Arthur will talk. If you like to interrupt or ask a question, there are two microphones. And please, if you do, go up to a microphone because it's very difficult to understand it. Well, my first question, Arthur, is you studied Japanese art and history. I don't think, also hearing from your story, you thought I'm going to study Japanese art because one day I'm going to write a bestseller about a geisha and Spielberg is going to make a movie out of it. So why? It doesn't seem to me like this is, you must do it out of love or interest or fascination and not out of the idea that this will make you a big career, right? So why Japan? Why did you do it?
There's absolutely no question that I did not do this because I thought it would be a big success. I mean, I really thought, my feeling is in the years that I worked on this book was I just wanted what I thought of as a seat at the table, which is to say, I wanted to get my novel published and earn the right to struggle the rest of my career for some recognition, which is what, you do if you're lucky.
Yes.
And you're a fiction writer. I certainly didn't imagine the book would do so insanely well. And why did I write about Japan is a very good question, because there is a discontinuity in my life. I studied Japan, then I decided to stop studying Japan, and at a certain point I decided I wanted to write. And I didn't have to write about Japan. In fact, my next novel won't have anything to do with it. But there was this story that I mentioned that seemed fascinating to me, the young man whose father was a powerful businessman, whose mother was a geisha. I had no idea that what I was getting myself into, really, when I started.
And one step before, how did you get to choose to study Japanese art and history to begin with?
I'll tell you if you promise not to laugh. Okay. You see, you're already brought. I'm not going to tell you. All right, I'll tell you. But you got to hear the whole story because you're going to laugh when I say the first. I read Shogun. I told you were going to laugh, and you're all laughing. I read Shogun, and I was fascinated by the little snippets of Japanese in it, and so I tried to learn some of them, and I decided to try them out on a young woman that I knew who was Japanese. When we were having a conversation, I said, "Oh, listen, you ready?" And I said it, and she said, "What?" And I said, "Well," and I said it again, and she said, "What?" And I showed her the book, and she started laughing. She said, "It's all wrong. None of it makes any sense." And so I had a long conversation with her about the language, and I thought it was so fascinating that I was just about to start studying Italian, and I switched at the last minute. It's true. It's true. And I took Japanese instead. And after that, things got out of hand.
I love your answer, because I believe that many big decisions in your life, and this, of course, it's been an influential decision in your life to do this,
Very, yeah.
are almost like coincidences, almost like...
Well, it's like meeting
this
your
had to
wife,
happen.
or
Yes.
it might not have happened. I mean,
Yes.
yeah.
Okay. So yes, it's true. So you worked hard on this book. This is very, very obvious. I didn't know how hard you worked on it before you told me that there had been more versions. So I, first of all, I admire the courage to start again. Just to think that you've written all this stuff and then you think, well, something is not quite right with it, and you start all over. Huh? This is, you must have really wanted to do this. But my question is, when it came out, I mean, there's a moment when you have to let go. Like your child's grown up, they go out of the house, this is it. Once it's published, you have no influence on how people read it, how they will react to it. Were you afraid when it came out of people reading it? And
No,
No?
it may go back to that old thing about men basically being lunks or something, because the thought actually never occurred to me to be afraid. I mean, my feeling was, I have to confess I was a little nervous about how the book would be received. Maybe that's really what you're asking. But the idea that somebody would read the book was a thrilling thought to me. I mean, after all, for me, writing is an act of communicating. It's like speech. It's not to say you don't sing in the shower, you don't talk to yourself or something, but you certainly don't write a novel to yourself. I mean, you write a novel in the hopes that somebody out there will read it. And I was thrilled by the idea that the book was going to be published and that people would read the book. And yeah, sure, I was a little apprehensive about how it would be received.
And you're from the, let's say, post-feminist generation. So you must have been aware of the fact that you were writing a book about a woman, and not about a woman, but from inside out. Did you give any thoughts about that there would be women who would say, well, listen, this is a nice try, but doesn't convince me?
Sure.
Yeah?
Absolutely. Yeah, oh yeah, sure. And in fact, there was that moment I mentioned where I, formulated the plan of having a week-long anxiety attack. I mean, I'm making light of it, but I don't know how else to look back on it, because that was a very, very low point when I felt I put 6 years into this. And it wasn't just that I put 6 years into the project. If I looked at it another way, I'd put maybe 10 years into becoming a novelist. And here, I'd taken the best material I could find and made it boring. I mean, that really, it looked like 10 years of possible waste, not 6. And I think that, at that point, I was absolutely panicked. But I remember that after I made the decision to go ahead and write the book from the point of view of a woman and take this risk, when I decided I had enough material to give it to a friend, I gave it to a very good friend of mine, a woman, in fact, and for the 3 days it took her to call me back, I couldn't do anything. I was so nervous. I remember driving around in my car with this anxiety, in my stomach, because if she called me up and said, Arthur, I don't know how to say this, which she would have, she's very truthful, I wouldn't have known what to do. Happily, she called me up and said, this is really good. And that, I was ecstatic after that. So I kept reminding myself of that as I wrote the rest of the book. Yes. But there was no question it was a huge risk. And it seemed that way to me. And of course, my family thought I was completely out of my mind. I mean, not my wife and my kids, but my brothers and my sister and my mother. My mother gave me the gift for 10 years of keeping her mouth shut, She did. She didn't say anything. Which is much better than the alternative, much better than the, why don't you get a job,
So, do you have any idea if male readers or female readers reacted differently to your book? Have you?
I don't know, because mostly, in my experience, mostly women read fiction. More women than men read fiction. So more women read my novel. Perhaps more women read my novel than read other novels. But I have met a lot of men who've read the book, and a lot of men whose wives have made them read the book, kind of thing.
Yes.
You know? And that happens with books.
Yes,
you
it
know.
does.
So I'm not entirely sure.
Because this, of course, is mixed up with this idea of what is a geisha? Because I can imagine that people who see this book, Memoirs of a Geisha, think, this is exotic stuff. This is going to be sort of semi-sexual, soft pornography sort of thing. And this is not what they get. It's sensuous, absolutely. But it's not the sort of, here come the exotic stories about geishas. So I can imagine that there are readers who read this book looking for something that's not in it.
In fact, my English publisher sent me a press clipping from one of the really trashy English rags. I don't remember which one it was. I think it was The Sun, actually. But anyway, it said, stuffy Minister of the Exchequer so-and-so, I don't know who the Minister of the Exchequer is, caught reading steamy novel.
Yes. That's a steamy
And
novel.
it was my book on his desk, photographed on his desk. And whoever wrote this piece had to read through the book to find the racy passages, and there aren't any really racy passages. So they'd excerpted things that looked like they might have been racy, but censored, or something. It was a very strange bit of journalism, if you can call it that. It's not a racy novel, and in fact, my editor was all over me about this. She said, this is a novel about a geisha, and there's got to be a steamy side, because that world has a steamy side, and I really don't think you're being honest. I think you've left things out. It's not that I want a steamy novel. I'm making it sound like there's a possibility that she's a kind of trashy sensibility, and nothing could be further from the truth. She felt that I wasn't presenting the world accurately. And in fact, there was a moment when my wife read one part of the book and said, I don't believe this. It was the part about Mameha explaining to Chio, or Sayuri by then, about the eel in the cave. And which I, invented. That's not a thing that geishas say to each other. But I had Sayuri reflect, telling the reader that the first time she'd ever had her period, she felt like she'd blown her nose and pieces of her brain had come out into the handkerchief. She didn't know what was going on. She thought she was dying. And my wife said, that's not possible. If she grew up in a house full of other women, there's just no question that she would have known more than that. But, my research had told me otherwise. They didn't talk about it. They didn't know what was going on. And in fact, the tradition was that before a geisha's mizuage, what she was told by her mother was, jitto shinasai, and that means lie still, which is a little like saying, think of England, And that's as steamy. I mean, it doesn't suggest a steamy underside to that world. I don't think there really is one.
No, I don't think we agree on that completely. But the funny thing is, this afternoon I did a mini interview on your book on the radio, and there was this journalist who thought this is going to be really, really exciting, because here on the one hand is this feminist writer, and on the other hand there is this male writer writing a book about the geishas. So this must be really opposites, huh? And he expected. First he asked me, how can you do this? And I asked him, what do you mean? He said, well, this is this exotic book. And I said, what do you mean? And he couldn't express himself, but I could feel what he was meaning, what he was getting at. He thought would be absolutely opposite. And for one thing, he didn't know that I have a great respect of working women, of whatever sort of work they do. And you did not write a steamy, exotic novel. So he obviously didn't know what he was talking about. But there must have been many misunderstandings about your book before people read it.
All the time. I get letters all the time that say, I really did not want to read this book, and my friend kept after me, and I finally did it to shut him up, and things like that, because it does seem, first of all, I mean, I'm the first to admit that when you look at a book that says Memoirs of a Geisha, and it's by Arthur Golden, there's something that doesn't make sense there. There's something that doesn't make sense. And, I mean, the only way in which it does finally make sense is that I, as I explained, keep myself really out of it. It's not about me. It happens to be written by me, but I was trying to impersonate another sensibility, and that's really what I think the book is about.
Yes.
I mean, that's what counts to me.
So you told us some details about how you did your research. Like I like the scene you in the bathroom trying to put on makeup. But many details I can think, yes, I can imagine how you interviewed, how you made interviews, how you found out about details like that. But one part of it, I think this is really fascinating. How did you get these images? I forgot her name, the woman you interviewed, tell you this?
Minako.
And this is about the clients, let's say the clients, the men. And this is absolutely not a steamy side of the book, because you meet in this book men who are bad-mannered, they are bored, they are silly. One part of being a geisha is playing beautiful, elegant music like we have heard, but the other side is you have to think of drinking games all the time, and drinking too much is a professional hazard. You showed this also very well. You have to drink with the man. You have to have an endless amount of jokes ready to amuse them. Where did you get this image of what the man would be like who go to a geisha?
It's not a flattering portrait of Japanese men that I present in the book, and I don't think in some ways that it's entirely fair, the portrait of Japanese men that I present in the book, because Japanese men are like anyone else. They have, many of them are sensitive, and they have, things like that. But it is true that one of the hallmarks of Japanese society is that there's a kind of situational ethic. When you're in the office, one set of rules apply. When you're out with the guys, another set of rules apply. And it's very common in Japan to see businessmen walking down the street, staggering drunk, throwing up on the sidewalk. You might see a businessman leave a bar on the arm of a prostitute. That happens in the U.S. He's in big trouble. He's going to lose his job over it. But it isn't that way in Japan. And it's different from the attitude actually here in Holland too, because the feeling there is it's all right because of the circumstances and because of the rules that apply. Well, the rules that apply in a tea house are, we're here to have fun. And men become very selfish. They become very sort of wagamama, which is a Japanese word that means selfish, but it suggests a little boy who gets his way. And they don't feel like they have to be entertaining, and they don't feel like they have to be charming, and they don't have to be on good behavior. They're there to have their sake cup filled and to be made to laugh and to be held over the toilet when they throw up. I mean, it's really pretty basic stuff. And I really do believe that one of the things that happens in circumstances like that is a lot of men, I mean, to use the Freudian term, digress. That's writing. You digress. Thank you. They regress. And they really do become like little boys. And that was what I was trying to capture.
Yes.
I don't think it's true of all the people in the book. I think Nobu, for example, maintains his dignity, even at one of these drinking parties. But can I just tell you about the party that I went to in Tokyo
please.
During the course of the research? All right. So there's a guy who's the chairman of a big company in Japan who was persuaded to invite me to go to a geisha party, and I was taken. And the guests were a famous Japanese rock star and his absolutely beautiful wife. Later on, we were in a bar, and there was a video, a karaoke video of his song that he wrote for her. And they were sitting there, and one of the geisha was singing the words. It was sort of a surreal moment. But and a professional Japanese golfer, a woman, and a bunch of geisha. And the evening started, I mean, this was like the first thing. Introductions were made, and out of the pocket of the chairman of the company comes a bottle of pills. And they call these things liver pills. And the idea is that you take a bunch of them to prevent a hangover. And depending on your weight and how much you're planning to drink, you take a certain number of pills. And he went pile of these things, and so did this rock star. And I knew right away I was in trouble. So the trick is, that somebody taught me this years ago, you eat all your pickles out of a dish, and then you take the dish, because it has a high lip on the side, and you put it under the tray or under the table. And then, when somebody pours your sake cup full, it's very rude not to drink, but the Japanese don't know the trick. Oh my God, look, it's Halley's Comet, you know? And so you pour out the sake. And I managed to stay sober. These guys were so drunk at the end of the evening, and the drinking games were very sophisticated things. For example, 007. Here's how this works. You put a penalty glass of sake, about this much sake, in a cup in the middle of the table. And now somebody starts. He says zero in Japanese, 0. The next person says 0. The next person says 7. The person who says 7 then has to shoot somebody in the room, like this. And the person who gets shot can't move. You have to sit there. But the people on either side have to go, woo! I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding. Could I make this up? It has to go, woo! And then the person who got shot now says 007, and then woo, and it keeps going like that. Now the idea is that if you forget to say 0 or 7 when you're supposed to, or if when you're shot you move, or if you don't go whoo when you're sitting on either side of the guy who got shot, you lose the round, and you go with the sake cup, which doubles the likelihood that you're going to lose the next round. So you can see really where those things in the book came from.
You give us some idea, because this was a lot of other details. I was very interested in where you got them from, huh? Because I really felt you must have done years of research to do this. But this feeling is, people don't show it like that, and especially since you are not a geisha, how do you know how men behave? But you gave a very convincing answer to that. But you must have spent a lot of time thinking inside of a geisha, also this sort of, oh God, how am I going to amuse them this time? And there's this man again, and also obvious, some I liked, and some they think, oh, there he is again, and he's not going to do anything to help me entertain him.
And I think that happens. I did invent a game in the book that, as far as I know, doesn't exist, although my daughter and I have played it since, called Big Liar, which I made up, where you tell a couple of stories and one of them is false and you try to guess which one and that sort of thing,
yes.
As a way of dealing with exactly the problem you suggest. But it doesn't seem at all unlikely to me that somebody might invent such a game.
It was a wonderful way to tell little stories.
Yeah, that was what I was using it for, really. But,
there is a question from the audience, and then there are two questions, and then you can interfere. I hope you will. One is, has the book been translated in Japanese?
The book is being translated into Japanese and comes out there in October. I don't have the least idea what the reaction will be to the book. I should say, though, that I'm playing a terribly important role in the Japanese translation, because I get these email messages from the translator every so often saying something like, well, now on page such and such, you say she's eating a rice ball wrapped in a lotus leaf, but I've never heard of such a thing. You must have meant a bamboo leaf. And I email him back and say, go for it. And that's the terribly important role I'm playing in the translation. And the book will come out there at the end of October. They, if they have any idea what the reaction is going to be, they haven't told me, and I have none, absolutely none. The book, to my delight, has had a very good reaction in Japan in English, from Japanese and Americans and so on, but that's in English. That's a very different beastie.
But did anyone who knows Japan, who is Japanese and has read your book, said this or that part does not?
There are some interesting problems. For example, I mean, the first thing I should say is that this is an unapologetically Western novel. It is not a Japanese novel. And anybody who thinks that this novel, in this novel I was trying to impersonate a Japanese writer, may be sort of a little bit misled by, very naturally and understandably misled, because the way in which the story is told is very Western. And what's more, Sayuri's way of expressing herself is rather Western. One of the problems that I struggled with was that a Japanese woman, in reality, in telling a story like this, especially if she's been trained as a geisha, is not likely to let us very deeply into her psyche. But I wanted to get the reader a little further into the psyche than that. Mm-hmm. And I decided that it's a kind of a conceit that you can get away with if you just do it and make it, don't apologize for it in a way. But the other thing was I wanted to try to create a certain character of mind for this person who I was inventing. And one way in which I found it useful to do that was through her use of language, that she expresses herself in a very particular way, unlike other people. So she says, such and such a thing was like this other thing over here. Those expressions are in fact not Japanese.
Or like a tipsy house.
Or the tipsy house. I mean, these are things that wouldn't really be found in a Japanese novel. And Japanese don't express themselves typically in that way. Now, is it impossible? I mean, my excuse is, well, of course, she's lived in New York for 40 years.
Yes.
I mean, that's
that was a way of... But
it's a sort of a cleansing.
Yes, but it wouldn't be enough, because part of it is really about her as a child, and she uses words like a tipsy house that are typically childish, and you wouldn't make up things like that because when you grow older, you'd live in New York. You can't remake all the words of your. But to me, it's very convincing. But it would be very interesting to find out if Japanese people have the same sort of identification.
Well, people who it bothers, I mean, I had a very interesting encounter when I was invited to go to a Japanese literature department at a university, and there was the professor who taught me, actually, when I was an undergraduate, and we were sitting there talking about the book. It bothered a lot of them that these things weren't Japanese, mm-hmm. and that the book was going to seem to most Americans to represent Japan, and that they would somehow be misled. I think that's something only a professor could worry about, mm-hmm. in a way, Mm-hmm. I didn't mean that quite the way it sounded, but a professor of Japanese literature could worry about, because that's not the point. I think it's a really secondary issue. I wasn't really trying to represent all of Japan. But anyway, I guess we're getting off the subject.
No, it's questions like, what are you representing? I can't see where she is. I had a little discussion also in the interval about that I, as a feminist, should, I think, worry more about the fact that the woman in this book is not behaving strongly enough or whatever. And I did not have that feeling at all when I read it. My feeling is it convincing that a person would behave like that under those circumstances? And to me this is true. I don't think you write a novel as a symbol of anything, really.
No, otherwise it becomes a didactic novel.
Yes.
It's like Les Miserables, where Victor Hugo really was using the characters to represent political ideals and moving them around like pieces of chess pieces mm-hmm. on the board to show mm-hmm. important political issues. And I mean, this is not that kind of novel. It really is a novel where everything is subsumed to the principal idea, which is this character telling her story.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I have another question, completely different. As a former Foreign Service officer, I started wondering, when I'd read the translator's introduction, how in the world you were going to arrange an immigrant visa to the US for Sayuri. Obviously, I'm still wondering. Is this one of those things the author chose to leave out?
That is a riot, actually. That's a great question. That one, unlike any I have ever heard. Well, here's how I was going to get her a visa. No, I'm just kidding. The thought never did occur to me. It was one of those little things I decided just to leave out. But it raises actually a very serious question. It really does raise a serious question, which can bog writers down, and did me, as I mentioned, for years when I believed that you had to put everything in the book. It turns out that it's all a matter of what you can get away with. And if you read, especially short stories where the writer usually has to contrive more heavily and more dramatically than in a novel. You often, if you read the story a couple of times, you'll start to notice things that don't make any sense and can't possibly have happened that way. Chekhov does it better than anyone, where the characters are doing things that later when you read it, wait a minute, that can't have happened like that. But it works. It makes the story work and you don't notice it. It's all, as it turns out, a matter of what you get away with. And I got away with this until tonight. Now my cover is blown.
Okay, does anybody would like to ask some more questions? Yeah. Yeah? Please.
Good evening. I'm Xavier Hollander, and maybe you know from your youth when you're still a teenager, I wrote a book called The Happy Hooker, which is like a geisha in New York story. Steamy it was.
Yeah. I remember that book.
Got me kicked out of the country, by the way. No visa there. I heard you say earlier on that those geishas were actually entertainers, of course. Now, other than playing instruments, I'm talking about musical instruments, could you tell us a bit more, like, did they do origami? Did they do flower arranging? I heard you said they tell stories or jokes, but was there any dancing? Was there any maybe entertaining of the ladies? I'm also quite a feminist, and I only hear about disgusting men being drunk all the time. But was there a humor? Is in your book any real sense of humor between the ladies of the geishas and the clients? I'm curious.
Well, the answer is complicated, but let me keep it fairly straightforward by saying that one of the principal differences between Japanese society and Western societies is that in Japan, in Western societies, men and women entertain together freely. They always have. But in Japan, they always haven't. The men go out and the women stay home. And like it or not, that's the way it is. That's the way it's always been. Yeah, that's changing a little bit, but it's not changing as much as you would think it might. Even now in 1999, it's still more true than not that men go out together and women stay home. Geisha don't entertain women. There are no women in the tea houses. They're all men. Now, obviously that isn't entirely true because women go to Japan on business now as executives, and they are taken as business executives with some bemusement by their Japanese hosts to geisha parties. They're used to taking men to the geisha parties. Now suddenly there are men with their wives. There are women who are themselves executives with their husbands who come to the geisha parties. It alters the formula a bit, but the formula itself is you entertain men, and geisha are entertainers, meaning, to answer your first question, that they specialize in arts of entertainment. Origami really isn't considered one, and neither is flower arranging, because flower arranging in itself and origami in itself are pretty dull. The flowers are pretty, but she says in the book, if you want to know why we don't do flower arranging, it's because if you try to arrange flowers by way of entertaining a man, you're going to find that pretty soon he's put his head down on the table and gone to sleep. But they do tea ceremony, which is a sort of somewhat more serious, and it's not really an entertainment so much, but it is a presentation or performance. And they do dancing, on which they pride themselves more than anything else. And they do singing, and they tell jokes, and they pour drinks, and they try to keep their customers happy.
Thank you.
So now you know if you want another career.
My new career is producing top-class English theatre. So I'm still, as I could say, a fetishist of the spoken word in English.
Oh.
But I'm now letting other people play the roles that maybe you...
A third career, maybe, at the tea houses for women.
Happy hooker to happy booker, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
First of all, I wanted to say that I read your book and I liked it very much. And
Thank you.
so I read it a second time. And one of the things that I noticed the second time that I read it was that, I think it's the chairman, I read it a little while ago, that he fixates on Sayuri when she's a very young girl, like I think many years before she makes her debut as a geisha. And I wondered, when I read it that second time, I thought, well, that's a little creepy. And I wondered if you meant for there to be a sort of disturbingly Lolita-esque element to the love story, if that was something maybe, I don't want to be insulting, typically Japanese, or what made you, how did that come about?
You know, this book came out in October of '97, and I've been answering questions about it ever since, and this is, I think, my last time, because I'm chaining myself to my desk on May 31st. I've already bought the chains. And that's it. And you're the first person who's ever brought that point up. And it's a really interesting and somewhat disturbing point, because, no, I did not want the chairman to seem like a pedophile. But I wanted to make the story work, and she had to be young when he met her. There was no other way I could work this out in my mind. And I wrestled with that, and I finally decided that I had to finesse it. I had to de-emphasize the elements in the book that would make it look like there was pedophilia involved, and emphasize instead the elements in the book that would make it look as if it was just an act of human kindness, because I didn't want it to seem that way. And I'm glad it didn't seem that way to you the first time you read the book. I'm not entirely surprised it did begin to seem that way the second time, but thanks.
I was wondering what you thought about the part of the ritual in Japanese society, the part that the ritual plays.
Yeah. Well, ritual is a fascinating thing, and of course plays a big part in any culture. I suppose I believed that some knowledge of ritual in Japanese society as a whole would be enough to guide me through this act of imagination and creating a world of geisha. And in that I was dreadfully wrong, because it was the rituals of geisha life. It really was the rituals of geisha life that seemed to me to define that world once I learned about them. And that was the thing I felt I had been missing in that first draft, which led me to throw it away. So it wasn't so much the rituals of mainstream Japanese society, but the fact that, for example, geisha were very superstitious. I hadn't even known that until Mineko, this geisha that I interviewed in Kyoto, told me about sparking a flint on the back of a geisha before she goes out for the night to wish her good luck, that the geisha never goes out until somebody sparked a flint on her back. And about the elaborate ritual of that first night with a new dan, a new man. If it's for me, tell him I'm not here. That kind of fascinating way in which, well, I asked her, what happens? And I was a little nervous because I didn't know if she would tell me, but she did. She said, well, it starts like this. There's a very formal dinner, and everybody comes to the very formal dinner, and then afterward this happens and that happens. You wear a red robe, and you do this and you do that, and it's very ritualized. And those rituals, I think, were, people assume that I know so much about this world. But for me, really, I've got to tell you that what I was doing was smoke and mirrors. I was trying to create the illusion of an easy familiarity with every aspect of this world, because I knew that that's what a geisha would have. And the geisha would casually refer to the way in which this ritual was played out, and casually refer to her knowledge of that aspect of that ritual, and so on. And so I had it all cataloged and printed up, and I had reference books, and I was constantly pulling them off the shelf and educating myself and interviewing people who might know other things besides what I'd already learned. It really was, I think, one of the keys to creating that world.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello, good evening. I read your book and I liked it, and then when I finished it, I looked backwards on it, which happens when you read a book. And then I start feeling it's wonderful. She has a lot of her life. She has all those wonderful experiences. I lived in Kyoto for a couple of months too, and I know that area very well. And then you sometimes find out after you read a book that actually what is a second character becomes more important in your memory. And I became more and more fascinated by Hatsumomo. And why is she so bitchy? And I start wondering now, haven't you sweetened it up, the whole thing, a little too much? Isn't it too much of a wonderful love story? And I became fascinated by Hatsumomo. I'd like to know more about her. Why did she do all these awful things? Didn't you leave out a lot of bitterness in the life of her? Because Sayuri is not bitter at all. I mean, she's too good to be true, really. So I'm having just questions about the other person in the book that bothers me more.
Well, I think that's a good. This is Sayuri's book. Every time something in the book happened, the question was, It's not how I feel about it. It's not what I think about it. It's what does she think? And of course, I'm inventing her as I go. It's not like I had an idea beforehand of what she was going to be like. I sort of worked all that out as I made it all up. And this question of Hatsumomo, I have in my mind a very clear sense of what's the matter with her, and it's pretty serious stuff. You know, she is somebody who, and I've met people like this in that world, who was sold by her parents at a young age, who has developed into a terrible alcoholic in response to a miserable life, who may be beautiful, but is desperately unhappy and self-destructive. But the thing is, what will Sayuri know about her? How great a psychological insight can Sayuri herself give us into that character? And my conclusion was none. Sayuri will have no psychological insight into her character at all. She'll just be tormented by her. But later at the very end of the book, I tried to offer a glimmer of an insight into her character when Sayuri begins to feel sorry for Hatsumomo at the moment of Hatsumomo's downfall, which she herself is bringing about. And she feels it reminds her of a wasp that stung her when she was a child, and the boys in the pond pulled the wasp off and held it down to a rock while they decided how to kill it. And she looked at it struggling there and felt pity for this poor thing, even though it had stung her, that there was nothing it could do to keep itself from the death that was only moments away. And with Hatsumomo, this is the same thing, even though Hatsumomo's tormented her. Now she has Hatsumomo pinned to that rock, and it's the moment of Hatsumomo's destruction, and yet she feels sorry for her. And that Mameha comes around there, and she says, Mameha, if she were listening to me, would very much disagree, because she felt that Hatsumomo was bent on self-destruction, that she was somebody who was bound to kill herself. And that was the way in which I tried to put the authorial voice in, you know, to give some idea of what was the matter with this woman.
Last question.
Yes, I was curious. This is back on the Japanese translation. I read an article a couple of months ago in the International Herald Tribune talking about how difficult it was for the Japanese to find an appropriate translator, and how important it was that they had the right voice, that the dialect came from Gion, which is a very special way of speaking, and that the Geisha from Gion spoke even differently than the regular people of Gion. And you just talking about what you can get away with in terms of smoke and mirrors. How does it make you feel that they're going to so much trouble to make the voices even more authentic and more Japanese?
It is an interesting dilemma, and the translator emailed me very early on that he was very excited about this because this was the first and only time in his life he would ever translate a book into Kyoto dialect. Now, you know, dialects can't be translated. I mean, it's just something that can't happen. For example, I had a Japanese journalist actually ask me, why didn't you render the characters' dialogue when they're off at the sea, shore, and so on, and they come from a kind of hicky part of the country, in Southern English? Now, you know the answer to that. I mean, you know, what she's going to say, you know, I reckon I'm going to go on down to the store now. I mean, it does not work. You know, you cannot do it. It cannot be translated. The dialect can only be presented in its original language to make any sense at all. And so in turning the book back into Japanese, there's a difficult choice. Do you put it all in straightforward, standard Japanese? You can't. The whole book is written in dialogue. I mean, it's all told by her, and she comes from Kyoto, and it would seem ridiculous not to render it in Kyoto Japanese. But now, as soon as you make that choice, you've got to go the whole way. You've got to do it all right. You've got to get all the language right, because it's not standard Japanese anymore. And that's where the problem came in. Apparently 4 top translators turned the job down before this one took it on, and I got an email message from him on my little Palm Pilot that I use to check email. You know, it's really slow, but it works. Here in Amsterdam, a message from him just yesterday saying, I finished the translation, and I feel more and more confident that it will be the best work I've ever done. I wish my Japanese were better so I could appreciate it. You know, I mean, I think it's a fascinating problem, and I'm very eager to see how people react to it.
Very, very last question, very last question. You're going to leave Japan now with this book. I'm sorry, I didn't see you. You were standing behind it. I'm sorry. We have to stop with questions. But you have, please, sir. I didn't see you because you were standing behind.
Sorry about this belated entry into the fray. In the first place, I would make a little remark about a remark of Mrs. Beulenfeld in the introduction. I don't think your reference to Jane Austen was very fitting, inasmuch that Jane Austen didn't go to great length in her very beautiful novels, and I don't think anybody can have the slightest suspicion that it was written by not anybody else than a very capable lady. That's just one little remark. But as regards the novel we are talking about, I have great admiration for the research part of it. The non-fiction, well, it's a nice, entertaining novel. But I'm very great admiration for the amount of research. I've lived 9 years in Japan, and I've had the privilege of attending various geisha parties. As a Westerner, I could add a few anecdotes, also amusing. But what I would like to suggest that the geisha business is about to die. It is already dying a long time, but the whole atmosphere, I've arrived 3 years ago for the first time, in an interval of, I mean to say, I was, in 3 years I hadn't been there, and I saw a great difference, which I did not believe from reports and literature, that I think there is quite a new generation. In the beginning I did not believe it, but there is a new generation, and they're quite different from their elders. And they are more sophisticated.
I'm very sorry to interrupt you, but could you please get to the question, because
Well,
I was already starting to close the session.
Yeah, I know, this is the question. The question is, if you are quite sure, Mr. Author, about what you said just a moment ago, that this will go on still a long time. That is what it amounts to. But there is a new generation, and in my opinion, and I don't know if you agree with me, that's one question. The other question is if how this story about the New York phase of this geisha. I have also lived long years in the surroundings which you describe, and I have never met or heard anything like a Japanese club for expatriate Japanese in New York. It's a rather strange.
Well, let me answer your questions. I don't actually remember saying that I thought the tradition would go on for a long time. It's a good question. I'm not at all sure what the answer is. There are clear forces working against the survival of the geisha. One is that people begin it at 16 now. It's a career. They quit when they will get tired of it. It's not a life. That, for the women who work in that world, is a good thing. I mean, it's not a life, meaning it's not a way of life. It's a career. And that's a good thing, but it suggests that the profession won't survive in the way that it did. There are also economic forces working against it. The only thing it has working in its favor is that the Japanese are very good at preserving things they regard as unique to their cultural heritage. Geisha is certainly one of those things. It's possible it will survive. It's possible it won't. As far as the geisha clubs in New York, no, they don't exist. I made them up. I made it up so that she could end up in New York, so that she would have a Western sensibility, so that she could tell the story that I needed her to tell.
Okay.
Thank you.
You are. And I want to ask the very last question, the next book.
Oh, the next book, yeah.
It's not going to be in Japan?
No, it has nothing to do with Japan. In fact, I think it's going to start out in Amsterdam. And it's going to end up very quickly in the U.S. The bulk of it will take place in the U.S.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much.